I'm Mike Brown, author, nerd, and host of the Dark Poutine podcast. Join me and Morgan Knudsen, author, paranormal researcher, and host of the TV shows Paranormal 911 and Haunted Hospitals, as we take you on a journey for the curious about the unseen, the mysterious, and the incredible things happening in the world about us. Welcome to Supernatural Circumstances. We're going to get right into this, the second in our two-part series of episodes on Bigfoot, as we have a returning guest who's passionate about the subject. Author W.T. Watson talks to us from his home in Kitchener, Ontario, about his latest book, Sasquatch Canada, Beyond British Columbia. You can follow W.T. Watson on Facebook and Twitter, and his books are available on Amazon. Here's Morgan.
In part 2 of our Sasquatch journey, we take a look at some places that aren't often associated with the big guy. When you think of Bigfoot, what comes to mind? Forests, mountains, snowy icescapes. What about farmland, prairie, the Maritimes? No? Well, you're not alone. But the reality is, a huge portion of Sasquatch encounters don't come from the Rockies or the Sierras at all, but from provinces in Canada that are often forgotten on this cryptid journey. In 1957, sworn before the city of Edmonton, the province of Alberta, on the 26th day of August, a fellow by the name of William Rowe signed an affidavit, which till today remains in record. He said, "Ever since I was a small boy, back in the forests of Michigan, I've studied the lives and habits of wild animals. Later, when I supported my family in northern Alberta by hunting and trapping, I spent many hours just observing the wild things. They fascinated me, but the most incredible experience I ever had with a wild creature occurred in a little town in British Columbia, about 80 miles west of Jasper, Alberta. I'd been working on the highway for about 2 years. In October 1955, I decided to climb 5 miles up Mica Mountain to an old deserted mine, just for something to do. I came in sight of the mine about 3 o'clock in the afternoon after an easy climb. I had just come out of a patch of low brush into a clearing when I saw what I thought was a grizzly bear in the bush on the other side. I'd shot a grizzly near that spot the year before. This one was only about 75 yards away, but I didn't want to shoot it, for I had no way of getting it out. So I sat down on a small rock and watched, my rifle in my hands. I could see part of the animal's head and the top of one shoulder. A moment later, it raised up and stepped out into the opening. Then I saw this was not a bear. This, to the best of my recollection, is what the creature looked like and how it acted as it came across the clearing directly toward me. My first impression was of a huge man about 6 feet tall, almost 3 feet wide, and probably weighing somewhere near 300 pounds. It was covered from head to foot with dark brown, silver-tipped hair, but as I came closer, I saw by its breasts that it was female. And yet, its torso was not curved like a female's. Its broad frame was straight from shoulder to hip. Its arms were much thicker than a man's arms and longer, reaching almost to its knees. Its feet were broader proportionately than a man's, about 5 inches wide at the front and tapering to much thinner heels. When it walked, it placed the heel of its foot down first, and I could see the gray-brown skin or hide on the soles of its feet. It came to the edge of the bush I was hiding in, within 20 feet of me, and squatted down on its haunches. Reaching out its hands, it pulled the branches of bushes toward it and stripped the leaves with its teeth. Its lips curled flexibly around the leaves as it ate. I was close enough to see that its teeth were white and even. The shape of this creature's head somewhat resembled that of a gorilla. The head was higher at the back than the front. The nose was broad and flat. The lips and chin protruded farther than its nose, but the hair that covered it, leaving bare only parts of its face around the mouth, nose and ears made it resemble an animal as much as a human. None of this hair, even on the back of its head, was longer than an inch, and on its face it was much shorter. Its ears were shaped like a human's ears, but its eyes were small and black, like a bear's. Its neck was also unhuman, thicker and shorter than any man's I had ever seen. He went on to say, I leveled my rifle. The creature was still walking rapidly away, again turning its head to look in my direction. I lowered the rifle. Although I have called the creature it, I felt now that it was a human being, and I knew I would never forgive myself if I killed it. Just as it came to the other patch of brush, it threw its head back and made a peculiar noise that seemed to be a half laugh and half language, and which I can only describe as a kind of whinny. Then it walked from the small brush into a stand of lodgepole pine. I stepped out into the opening and looked across a small ridge just beyond the pine to see if I could see it again. It came out on the ridge, a couple of 100 yards away from me, tipped its head back again, and again emitted the only sound I had heard it make. But what this half-laugh, half-language was meant to convey, I do not know. It disappeared then, and I never saw it again. Years later, on the Victoria Long weekend of 1988, a fascinating story took place in the Crandall campground located in the Waterton Lakes National Park in the southwest corner of the province. There were two couples with two cars at one campsite. A fellow by the name of Thomas Steenberg wrote in his second book, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, The Continuing Mystery, published in 1993. I heard first of this incident 3 months after it happened when Susan Ray Adams contacted me and told me of her story. She called me on the night of August 24th, 1988, after seeing my ad in the Calgary Press. I made arrangements to visit her home and interview all 4 witnesses separately. So impressed with this story, I delayed production of my book. Thomas Steenberg continues, When I visited Susan's home, all 4 witnesses questioned me extensively about Sasquatch in general. It was obvious all were still on pins and needles 3 months after their encounter with a Sasquatch. I was also handed a copy of a handwritten letter, which one of 4, Darwin Giles, wrote for the park warden's office the next day. Monday, May 23rd, at approximately 12:50 a.m. at Crandall Lake Campground, we spotted a very unusual animal. We were sitting at our campfire when we heard some snorting. We assumed it was a deer, but upon further observation, we decided it was a bear and bolted for our cars. The animal was on its hind legs, and we switched on the headlights of one of the vehicles. From the shadows, I could see the animal was moving on its hind legs, so I called to the other vehicle to turn on its lights. What we saw was incredible. This animal was not only on its hind legs, it was striding like a human. We watched as it walked through the trees for at least 3 to 4 seconds, immediately thought it was a joke. We are all convinced it was not a bear. We jumped into the same vehicle and followed in the general direction it disappeared. We came across another vehicle and flashed our lights. These people had also sighted something very strange and were quite scared. This confirmed that we had both seen the same thing. It's important to note that we are 4 mature, responsible, professional people. We thought very carefully before coming in to report this incident at the warden's office. All 4 of us are convinced this was not a bear. I am equally convinced it was not a practical joke, and if it was pretty elaborate and well done. From our sighting, the description we can give you is as follows. The animal was approximately 8 feet tall, as measured by the tree it was standing beside in our campsite. The animal was never on all 4s. When we switched on the headlights and got a good look, this thing was striding, and big strides at that. It also had long arms, which were swinging while it moved through the bush. It wasn't a bear, okay? I don't know what more I can write about this incident. would appreciate hearing anything that might explain what we saw or additional sighting, if any. These are just a minute fraction of the stories which are coming from the wonders of Canada and in places which are, for all intents and purposes, unexpected. Join us now for our discussion with author Travis Watson for this unique conversation on Canadian Sasquatch. So this is a great conversation that we're about to have, because it always is, with you, Travis. And I'm so looking forward to this. Here, last week we just had Alexander Petikoff on talking about Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever name that people associate with these amazing creatures, on to talk about Alaska. And today we get to make this a little bit more close to home and bring this home a little bit with Bigfoot in Canada, with your brand new book. So thank you so much for coming and chatting with us today.
I'm happy to be back again. It's always a pleasure talking with you guys.
It's always so much fun, because I always feel like we get so much out of these conversations.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, Mike? I learn something new every time we sit down with something like this, and I'm excited about your book, because oftentimes when people think about Bigfoot, they think about BC, they think about the Sierra Mountains, they think about all of these places where all these hotspot sightings have been documented over the years. And here you've decided to do something completely different and swing outside of those hotspots into the rest of Canada, which I don't think a lot of people realize. There's a lot of Sasquatch around Canada.
There are. Well, and that is precisely the reason that I did the book the way I did. When I was doing my research for Canadian Monsters and Mysteries, which we've also talked about, I decided early on that there were a couple of things I just wasn't going to be able to do to include in the book, or it would be 500-page monolith. One was hauntings, because Canada's got a rich history of ghosts. The other thing was Sasquatch, because again, Canada has a rich history, rich set of encounters of these creatures.
Totally.
When I started to do the research and I decided that the Sasquatch book would have to be a completely different text. And when I started to do the research for the book, I realized very quickly, that most of the books that are written about Sasquatch were written by American authors, and they are, and that's not to say I'm sure that there are some Europeans that have written on this subject. There's, there are other Canadians that have written on this subject. But, one of the things that I found was, you had these American authors, and they're telling American stories, and that's great. But when they talked about Canada, it was like there was this polar ice sheet, above the U.S. border. There's just like this place where these people lived in igloos and skied all the time. Other than BC, which, is obviously a hot spot of Sasquatch sightings, there wasn't a whole lot of mention of other Sasquatch encounters in Canada at large. Other than there were a couple of mentions. I think Rene Dehinden in one of his books mentioned a set of sightings that occurred around the Bighorn Dam, in, I believe it's in Alberta. And then Lauren Coleman, in one of his books on, cryptozoological subjects, which he's written a ton about. Lauren Coleman mentions yellow top, which is a Sasquatch that was seen over a period of years in Cobalt, Ontario area. And those are the two that I found that got mentioned, on a more or less regular basis. There are a couple of other sightings that have made it into other Sasquatch books, but for the most part, um, once you get east of British Columbia, Canada sort of disappears into the nether regions of
Yeah.
Sasquatchery. And so I thought, okay, well, fine, let's take a look and see, you know, how many, Sasquatch sightings there actually are in Canada. And I was amazed. I found Sasquatch encounters in every single province in Canada
Mhm.
except for Nunavut. And I think that probably, there are probably some encounters in Nunavut. They're just, you know, not things that people have talked about yet. Um, and I won't be surprised if I don't get an email, sometime after one of these podcasts from Sodi and Nunavut. So I saw Bigfoot.
You say you're finding all kinds of sightings all over Canada, but is anybody really keeping track? I know, like for UFOs, there's somebody, Chris Ratowski is the guy
Sure.
keeping track. But is
Yeah.
there anybody here in Canada other than yourself, maybe, who's keeping track of these kind of things?
Well, I can't claim to be the database person for Sasquatch in
Right.
Canada. So the Bigfoot Field Researchers Association, which BFRO, everybody knows about BFRO. They do have Canadian sightings in their database. Okay, so that's one place where people are making reports. There is a group of folks that are native to Canada in Alberta, the Alberta Sasquatch Organization, who also keep a database that's quite nice. And there is a Sasquatch Canada database, which is also a place that people will make reports to. Neither of those guys are quite as extensive as the BFRO databases, but they do have some really interesting sightings that you don't find in the American database. So yeah, there are people that are kind of logging these things in. But like I said, people just don't realize. Yeah, I mean, in my notes for this book, I would say, I didn't actually take account, but in my notes for this book, I probably have notes for something like 200 different encounters across Canada. And that's
Wow.
probably that's visual sightings. That's not the what people call class B encounters, which are, I had a creepy feeling in the woods, or I found tracks, or there were vocalizations around me, or those kinds of things. That to me is a whole separate thing that I intend to deal with in another text. But
Yeah. Did you notice a difference between the Canadian Bigfoot stories and other areas of the world? Like, does Canada have any significant differences, or are they pretty much universal?
I don't claim to be the world's expert on Sasquatch. There are people obviously who've been doing research in this field for decades. But I have been fascinated by this creature since I was a kid, and I'm in my 60s now. I actually read, Ivan Sanderson's Abominable Snowman book back when I was in 6th grade. So, I've kept
Awesome.
my finger kind of on the pulse of what was going on in Sasquatchery over the years. So I think I have a pretty good handle on the stories that are out there. And I don't find a whole lot of differences between the Canadian Sasquatch and, the, say, Pacific Northwest Sasquatch. Now, when you start talking about things like the skunk ape in Florida, which tends to be smaller and wirier, or more wiry, I guess, you might start to see some differences there. When you start to talk about, for instance, Stan Gordon's sightings out of Pennsylvania, and some of the high strangeness that revolves around those sightings. If you've read Silent Invasion, there's some really weird stuff in that book. And some of that stuff, involves what he calls Bigfoot. I prefer Sasquatch. But the vast majority of sightings are just you could substitute in I saw a bear in the woods, except that the bear was 8 feet tall, bipedal, and weighed about 800 pounds.
Oh boy.
Because
Right.
for the majority of people who have an encounter with Sasquatch, it's like that. They're in the woods, they're doing something, they're hunting, they're forestry people, they're law enforcement officers, they're special forces people in Canadian forces, and they see this creature, and it looks flesh and blood to them. They're very convinced that this is an animal. It's an unknown primate. It's an unknown hominid. Whatever. It's massive. If they get too close to the creature, it really scares the bejeebies out of them. But it is very much like a wildlife sighting, and you see that it is a wildlife sighting to them. And you see a lot of that in American stories as well. But there is always that small percentage of stories, both in the U.S. and in Canada, that have a high strangeness element to them. Whether it's the creature vanishes in front of the person. I have a story about mind speak in my book. Young man is out, encounters the Sasquatch picking berries. This is in Strathcona Park, if I remember correctly. It was in Alberta. Strathcona Island Park in Medicine Hat. Yeah. It's this young man, it's summertime. They're off doing their thing, enjoying the river and swimming. They decide they're going to go back to their campsite, which is about 150 yards from where they are. And this witness, who's, was a child at the time, takes off, because he's like, got to get my hot dog, man. He was excited. As often happens with these sightings, the first thing that made him stop and consider was an odor. There's a certain percentage of Sasquatch sightings where people will tell you, oh, hey, the first thing I noticed was this strong odor. And in this case, the person reporting likened it to the smell of a newly washed dog that had been rolling in garbage for a week.
Lovely.
You hear, it smelled like a skunk. It smelled like something rotting. There just seems to be a general air of yuck smell around some of these creatures. There have been people in Sasquatch research that have proposed the idea that the animal actually produces this scent if people get too close to them, as a way of keeping people at a distance. I don't know if I buy that or not. It may just be that Sasquatch are smelly. Who knows? But in any case, this witness is walking through the brush, and they turn and they look and they see this large creature at a range of about 30 yards. Now, the interesting thing is this Sasquatch was squatting. The witness says that its buttocks were inches from the ground, and it's hunched over Saskatoon berry bush and doing what most animals would be doing. It's having a snack. The other interesting thing is that even squatting, the witness stated that this creature was about 5 feet high and about 4 feet wide. Had the classic cone-shaped head and all that sort of thing. So he's looking at this thing. He has no idea what he's looking at. He knows it's not a bear, which is, the first thing that everybody says is, oh, you saw a bear. It's like, no, it's not a bear. It's too big to be a bear. but he's looking at it. He doesn't know what it is. He has no idea. He's never even heard of a Sasquatch, right? So he thinks to himself, what am I looking at? And something in his mind replies, you don't see me. I'm not here.
What?
Oh my God.
And he's going, wow, wait a minute. No. It's like, what am I looking at? And again, he hears the same thing. You don't see me. I'm not here. Now, when it becomes apparent that, the witness is not going to buy into this whole, it sounds like an attempt at psychic manipulation, right? This being starts to make a chattering noise, and all of a sudden, all this kid can think of is, I got to get myself out of here. His thoughts are just filled with the need to go away, get out of this area, right? So he takes off for his campsite, and the Sasquatch takes off for a nearby creek. So they kind of go in opposite directions. The witness gets into the campsite, and of course, the first thing everybody says, "Oh, well, you saw a bear." He says, "That doesn't look like any bear I'd ever seen." Obviously, he'd seen a bear before. So then his family starts joking and said, "Oh, you must have seen a Sasquatch." He didn't even know what that was. And when someone finally explained to him what a Sasquatch was, he said, yeah, that's what I saw. So, it was just a really, really interesting sighting. And, a lot of Sasquatch researchers now are into this idea that, the Sasquatch might produce infrasound, and that this could account for the feelings of paralysis or terror that some people feel when they encounter these creatures. But infrasound doesn't explain the voice in his head telling him, you don't see me, I'm not here.
Right.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that story up, because I'd heard about encounters like this as well before, and I didn't know what the heck to think of it. I was just I was really on the fence. I was like, maybe these people are just responding to like their own fear, which was what I was originally thinking. And so I have a friend here in Alberta who hunts regularly. She hunts in everywhere from Edson, Hinton, all over the place. And she had an encounter not far from Edmonton that was really chilling. Because she's a hunter, she's had a couple of encounters with things like this and with Sasquatch, and she described the exact same thing. She had been leaving a friend's house in the woods, and she was going to her truck, and I can't remember whether she saw or heard but she perceived this one that was kind of off into the woods around this guy's house, which they were common in that area. And she got the distinct feeling, that same level of terror, and not just like, oh, something's wrong, but absolute terror. And this very distinct thought in her head. And she described it as, this wasn't my thought. This was something else. And she said, all it said was, I will end you. Like, you will be no more if you stay here. And it wasn't like, I will kill you. It was, I will make you not exist anymore. And she thought that was so strange, because it is such an odd way of thinking. But if you think about how, like, say, for example, an animal or something like that would perceive a death, you're not going to associate it with death. It is now suddenly something ceases to be there. And that was what she was getting from this. And she said she's never been so terrified in her life. She said it was kilometers down the road before she felt whatever it was let up. And she said it was the strangest thing. And she is probably one of the most competent people in my life. Like, she is not a flighty person. She's not a fearful person. As I say, she's out in the woods hunting and doing her thing. She's as stable as you want to get them. And she says she's never, ever, ever had that happen to her before or since. But when you told that story, that's what I was thinking of. And the guy that she was working with had said, yeah, it's Sasquatch on my property. It's interesting.
We see these kinds of encounters. I mean, not so much the mind speak aspect of it, but this absolute terror thing that comes on people. We see that kind of thing happen a good bit. But yeah, I mean, it's easy enough to explain that terror in the context of infrasound if you're in the immediate area of a Sasquatch. But I ran across a number of cases where the person fled the scene, and that terror didn't let up until they had gotten some distance away. So you have to think that the terror reaction is not just this creature making a sound in its immediate area and causing disturbances. Infrasound does produce feelings of fear and those kinds of dizziness, nausea, the kinds of things that you hear described in a lot of Sasquatch encounters. But it has a distinctive range, right? And once you're out of that range, you should be okay. But a lot of these witnesses aren't. They're so terrified that there's the case in the book where somebody went to a lake and encountered a Sasquatch, Cedar Lake, I believe. And they were so terrified that rather than continuing their drive to visit relatives, I believe it was in northern Alberta again, they went home, to Calgary. It was in Alberta. So they just went home and holed up in their house, and they called their some of their relatives and who actually talked them into coming out and going back to the site and looking at, because the person was convinced that if they hadn't gotten back on the horse basically and gotten back out into the wilderness when they did, they might have never gone into the woods again.
Yeah. Well, and again, that's a really common, a common story that people seem to be having. Like this wasn't in Canada, but down in the Sierra Mountains. A Facebook friend of mine, Alan Thomas, who's been public about his encounters for a long time. I mean, he said he didn't go back into the woods after that for 6 years, and it was a long time. Because I mean, I've said before on the show, like I've had encounters with dogmen and things like that. I've never seen a Bigfoot, but I don't know. Like there's something about that to me that I don't know whether that's an uncanny valley thing or what, but there's something about that I think that is so scary.
I would want to have a doctor check me out. Like, am I losing my mind? I'm hearing things in my head and seeing things that may or may not be there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Morgan.
So, oh no, I was just gonna say, you'd mentioned Calgary, and I know during the lockdowns here, there were sightings in and around closer to Calgary as well, and it seems like a lot of these creatures, I know in Alberta specifically, that they seem to be coming a lot closer to populations than they were prior. Did you find that too in your research?
What I saw was that a lot of these sightings that people reported did happen in the wilderness, but there were some that were in what you would call suburban areas, but they happened to be adjacent to large tracts of forest. So, it's pretty obvious the creatures, prefer the wilderness, but there are things that will draw them in.
Sure.
I have one roadside sighting in St. Catharines. Two truckers were driving along the QEW and saw a Sasquatch in a creek bed in St. Catharines. Now, 150,000 people, but I know from my own romping and stomping around here in Kitchener that the wildlife use the creek beds and waterways around here to travel in. I've seen foxes and all kinds of other creatures, and I know I've talked to locals who told me that they've seen deer down in those waterways. If there are deer, we know that Sasquatch like deer. That's pretty much a settled thing amongst researchers. So who knows? They may have actually seen a Sasquatch right there in the middle of a civilized area.
Yeah.
You're talking about hunters. And hunters do comprise a good number of people who've seen Sasquatch. And you've talked about how your friend is the solid person, somebody that you would rely on for information. There's another
Definitely.
Alberta story that's one of my favorites from the book. There's a story that comes from the Alberta Sasquatch people. And this is actually a story from a gentleman who was a special operations soldier in the Canadian Forces. And this happened during the time when he was on active duty. He was on a training exercise in the area of Wainwright, Alberta, back in May of 1983. He had another specialization as an electronics person. And he and his partner, person that he worked with, were driving a camouflage truck, trying to find a piece of electrical equipment that they were supposed to repair. So this is back in the days before, GPS, of course. So they stopped the truck. His partner had a topographical map out on the hood of the truck, and he's trying to figure out from the coordinates that they got where this piece of equipment was that they were looking for. Which left our trooper friend at loose ends while his buddy was trying to figure out where they were going. So he's looking off down the road, little dirt road that they were on. They're parked there in their camouflage truck. And he sees a deer off in a fire break. In addition to being a soldier, he's also a hunter, had been bow hunting since he was a young man. So he's watching the deer with some interest. And as he's watching, he sees a Sasquatch break cover on 4 legs, coming fast. As it's moving, this creature comes to 2 legs, snags this deer, snaps its neck, throws it across its shoulder, and disappears into the brush so quickly that he doesn't even have a chance to poke his partner and say, "Hey, look, there's a Sasquatch."
Yeah. Wow.
It all happens that fast. And he was dumbfounded, because A, he'd just seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. B, it was probably 7.5 to 8 feet tall, and again, easily 4 feet wide. He describes it as built like a football player. He's close enough to this creature to where he can see the hair flowing in the breeze as it's moving along, and it bounces as it's running, right? And he describes the head as that, that typical conical shape. Now, this man had been to Africa, and he had seen cheetahs hunt gazelle, and he likened the speed and agility of this creature to a cheetah. Now, that's something from a creature that's supposed to be 8 feet tall and, several hundred pounds, right?
You always think of
and
the
I
lumbering.
Think that,
yeah,
I think that part of the reason that we find Sasquatch to be really intimidating is the sheer physicality of these animals, whatever they are.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they're actually an unknown primate, an unknown hominid, or something else. Just the sheer size and speed and power of this creature is enough to intimidate anybody, including your friend, without the whole mind speak thing.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean the energy, I think just that people describe, I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And what you're saying too is scary on a number of levels, because of course, what's come into the public eye over the last, X number of years has of course been the missing 411, and these people that have been, just literally seem to up and disappear. And oftentimes you hear like big cats get blamed for it and things like this. But there's also this element where a lot of people have suggested, could this actually be something like Sasquatch or some sort of cryptid? What's your take on that?
I have very mixed feelings about that, because on the one hand, the vast majority of Sasquatch sightings, like I said, it's kind of like seeing a bear in the woods. Somebody says, "Hey, look, there's a giant, bipedal hominid walking the forest."
Sure, yeah.
There is a subset of sightings where the Sasquatch appears to be very Sasquatch or Sasquatches, plural, seems to be very territorial and intent on getting people out of their territory. And those kinds of encounters tend to be somewhat like the Dogman encounters, where the Sasquatch will continue to hound the person until they leave whatever area it is they need to leave, and then they pretty much leave them alone. It's like we get the accounts of the Dogmen, charging people and running them to a certain area and then breaking off their pursuit and going away. So
totally,
we see some aggressive tendencies in some Sasquatch, and I think that Sasquatch are probably somewhat like people. They have different dispositions, and some of them are kinder, have a disposition that is more amenable to having people around, and others have a disposition that isn't. Just like you have people who like having people around, and you have people who get tired of having people around.
Yeah.
Sure.
Now, does that mean that there's a certain subset of Sasquatch that maybe dislike people so much that they're willing to take them and do bad things to them? That's an
or even just
food.
for
food. That's a distinct possibility.
Right.
If we go to Kathy Strain's work, Cannibals, Giants.
Actually, she was exactly what I was thinking of. Then the question.
We have to realize that amongst indigenous people, who would be the experts on these things, as far as I'm concerned, there's a very distinct dichotomy about how they think about these creatures. On the one hand, there are some indigenous folks that view the Sasquatch as sort of a forest protector or guardian, or in some cases even the protector of the tribe. On the other hand, you have indigenous folks who believe that Sasquatches kidnap their kids and eat them. So there's no reason why both of those thoughts or ideas couldn't be true. So I don't place it outside the realm of possibility that the Sasquatch could be responsible for some, not all, but some of these missing 411 cases. I think that there are some things about the missing 411 cases that are even weirder than that.
Very much
then we start to get into interdimensional portals and stuff like that. But yeah. I mean, I know that there are, a group of people out there that want to see the Sasquatch as the gentle forest giant who, is wandering around having a herbivorous diet and all this sort of thing. But that's just not true. There are plenty of stories of Sasquatch hunting and eating meat. So I hate to say it, but I'm not above the idea that Sasquatch might actually supplement their diet with people.
Yikes.
Yeah, well, I mean, it would make sense. I mean, if you've got a population that, say, is removed or out hunting or something like that we might be somewhere on the menu. But and you brought up the idea just there about this idea, this sort of spiritual side to this. And for a long time I was very much opposed to that side of it. I was very much convinced that this was 100% flesh and blood primate that was there. And it wasn't until I was starting to do a little bit more research into and listening to what some of these people were saying, especially about the glowing eyes. And I thought this was so interesting because of all my work out here with Dogman, that's one of the things that has caught, I think, everybody the most is that you see these eyes and they're not, it's
Yes.
not eye shine.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
no light. It's like they are emitting their own light. And they're bright as Christmas lights. There's just shine out of the dark. And, you know, you can have no flashlight, no nothing, and you'll see these bright, bright, bright eyes. And then, so I was, you know, listening to some of these encounters and hearing them talk about these Bigfoot with these bright, bold red eyes, and it's not eye shine. And I thought that's so interesting because, you know, as I say, years ago, before I had anything to do with Dogman or anything else, my initial reaction was there had to have been a light. It had to be eye shine. This is a nocturnal animal. And then after that, it was like, this isn't eye shine. This is something else. So I'm really now looking hard at the spiritual side of what these things might be. Is this something that's similar, that can be physical when it wants and non-physical when it? So
Well,
I don't know. I will leave it to you guys. What are your guys' thoughts?
One of the
on
things
that?
that I put forward in the book, you know, is the idea that we need to get away from either or thinking when it comes to these things.
Totally.
There is no reason why it can't be both. You know, there may be
Exactly
a flesh and blood unknown primate or hominid living in wilderness areas throughout the world. I mean, because we have, you know, Sasquatch up here, we have, you know, the Bigfoot in the US, we've got Yeti over in Asia. You know, I mean, it seems obvious that you know, this thing, whatever it is a thing all over the world. Additionally, you know, we know, or we think we know, we have a pretty good inkling that there is an intelligence that likes to mess with people. You know, and whether that takes the form of UFOs or dogmen or Sasquatches or whatever, you know, there is this sort of trickster element out there that I think, you know, may be impersonating this unknown hominid. Secondarily to that, when you talk to indigenous people, they almost to a person will tell you that Sasquatch is a being that walks in two worlds. That when it is on this side of the veil, what I call the divide between what some people call the supernatural world and the physical world. I don't like those terminologies, but that's kind of words that people understand. When they're on this side of the veil, they are physical. They leave footprints, they leave hair, they poop, they do the things that animals do. When they're on the other side of the veil, they are spiritual beings. You know, and in my own, you know, personal spiritual quest, you know, I've talked to people who, you know, have very much are of the belief that there are beings that can walk from one world to another world through what they call the etheric plane, gather substance and appear as physical beings on our side of the veil. You know, if you read John Michael Greer, he wrote a book called Monsters, A Field Investigator's Guide to Magical Beings, which I think should be required reading for anybody who does this stuff. He's a Golden Dawn magician and druid, and he puts forth a magical explanation for a lot of the weird stuff that we see out there. He doesn't talk about Sasquatches, but he does talk about things like werewolves, which we could call dogmen very easily, and vampires and ghosts and other things. It's an interesting book, and even if you don't believe a word that he says, it'll make you think about this false dichotomy that we've set up between the real world, quote unquote, real world, and the supernatural. It's not really supernatural. It's all natural. It's just on different planes of being, you know?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, Mike, you and I have talked about this so many times where, you know, so much of it is either stuff that's out of our perception, or, there's that nothing really is, as we are not necessarily physical or non-physical. We're this a blend of both things.
I mean, you have only to look at things like out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, and so forth to realize that people are a lot stranger than we think we are. And only the most diehard scientific materialist is still clinging to that notion that, our consciousness is the product of, brain chemistry. There's a whole lot more going on out there than we want to admit. And Sasquatch is a part of that. You were talking about the glowing eyes, Morgan. There's actually a story. Let's see if I can find this real quick. Yeah, okay. So this is a historical story out of Newfoundland. Okay, the Newfoundland Labrador area comes to us from. Let's see. I think it's Bruce Hines' book, which dealt with the. It's cited in the bibliography. I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but dealt with the folklore, strange things in the Newfoundland Labrador area. So he tells a story about a bootlegger. So this would have been back, during more Prohibition type era, who liked to hide his hooch in his garden. So he would go into his garden late at night to dig up whatever stash he needed to sell the next day. So one night he's doing this. He's in the process of digging some of these bottles out of the ground, and he's startled to see this very bright light approaching him. And he's watching this light, and as he watches the light, it's coming toward him, and it's getting dimmer as it comes until it resolves into this huge, shaggy, 2-meter tall creature with short black hair and glowing eyes. Okay. So the bootlegger is like, oh my God, he's, of course, seized with terror, right? He stops digging. And as soon as he stops digging, this creature starts to move away from him. And this light from the eyes becomes dimmer and dimmer. And eventually it fades off into the night and disappears. The bootlegger's like, okay. So I stopped digging. It went away. He fills the hole and he goes back in the house. He's like, heck with it. I'll deal with this later, right? I one of my lines from the book says, one suspects that he may have partaken of his own merchandise that evening.
Yeah.
I think I might even be, induced to tipple a little after an encounter like that. So, but, there's business to be done. So the next evening he goes back out into his garden. He finds his spot again and he starts to dig. And as soon as he begins digging, the light reappears and approaches him, and this horrible creature with glowing eyes manifests itself and is moving toward him, and he stops digging. He fills the hole in. He goes back to his house, and as often happens in folkloric tales, the story has a moral ending. He decides to give up his life of crime after seeing this critter and goes on to less exciting forms of commerce. Now, the creature that approaches him certainly sounds like a Sasquatch. It's 2 meters tall. It's covered in short black hair. But it wasn't eye shine. This was definitely self-illuminating eyes. Now, this story is an uncorroborated folkloric tale. But, as you mentioned, Morgan, we see in these encounters repeated mention of this red eye shine, and it's not eye shine, this red self-illuminating thing. It reminds you of the phantom black dogs and their glowing eyes, right? So that you once again are forced to say, okay, what is this thing? That is producing eye shine, that is seen to disappear. There's a story, in this, there's a whole section of the book called Strange Things. There's a story in the
Yes, it's
Strange
a great
Things
chapter.
where, the fellow in the Yukon sees a Sasquatch walking along the side of the road. And he stops to look at this thing. And as he's watching it, it starts to fade from view. It literally just starts to fade out and disappears as he's looking at it. Now, I know that a lot of Sasquatch researchers want to explain these vanishing creatures as a combination of, that infrasound terror thing, and you get distracted and it bails out and disappears into the woods. He's watching this thing the entire time, and it disappears in front of him.
Yeah.
It just fades from view. It doesn't just vanish. It's like it becomes transparent and then fades out of sight. So again, what are we talking about?
So interesting.
Because there's so much, again, and this is why I subscribe to that both and theory, that there could be a flesh and blood creature out there as well as something else. So many of the stories that we see are, I was in the woods, I was sitting in my deer blind or whatever, and I saw this creature, and it was huge and it was scary, but, it walked away into the woods, and that was that. And, for all the world, like a bear or a mountain lion or, whatever, it's just another animal.
Yeah.
Until we come to these stranger stories. So there's this juxtaposition. So this is why I think it could be both things. We actually lost the wood bison in the forests of Canada for 50 years,
right.
until it was rediscovered. The largest land animal by weight in North America was thought to be extinct for some period of time until some, forestry guy flying along in a plane found a herd of them. So it's entirely possible that we could have a population of large bipedal primates or hominids wandering the woods of Canada. And, nobody just, they just see them every once in a while when they're wandering around, when they happen to be spotted. But then, you have the weird things.
No,
so
I agree.
I want to say, that it's entirely possible that both things are true, that we have a physical being and a spiritual being. And some people are seeing one thing, and some people are encountering something on their front porch that you shoot with a shotgun and it vanishes in a flash of light. That's actually a story from Stan Gordon.
Yeah. Well, like you and I, as I say, we've talked about this so much on the show that there's this non-physical, physical continuum, that's there. And I don't know, but Mike, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, like I'm trying to wrap my brain around all of this, really, because there's so much to unpack. Like, we've talked about so many awesome things, especially like when you mentioned losing the wood bison. It's like, oh my gosh, what? Why haven't I included that in my arguments to people who say, "Wow, this thing can't exist"? Now I'm a lot better armed, thanks to this discussion that we're having with you, Travis.
That's one of the things that I like to use as a, because there is a certain group of people out there that are like, well, I've been hunting the woods of Canada for 50 years and I've never seen a Sasquatch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I guess you just weren't lucky. Sorry.
Well, and the argument there too is like, well, then how many mountain lions have you seen? Most people will say none.
Yeah. Because mountain lions are elusive, right? Mm-hmm. If a Sasquatch is
and they don't have near the intelligence.
Right. If a Sasquatch is half as intelligent as we think it is, then we are going to have trouble finding these things.
Exactly.
Because they don't obviously want to be found. However, if you spend enough time in the wilderness and you happen to be in the right place at the right time, you might see one. Now, we can also posit that there may be an element of intentionality involved in seeing Sasquatch. Maybe you're in the right place, the right time, for the right reason.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
and that's a whole other conversation. But we've talked about
Yeah.
Sasquatch, we've talked about glowing eyes and Sasquatches vanishing and the possibility of Sasquatches snatching people and eating them, and all this horrible stuff, right? I'd like to at least give the Sasquatch the other side of the story, before we have to wrap up the conversation, because there's a wonderful story in the book about Carrie. Let me see if I can find. I'll bet she's in Alberta too.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Oh, probably.
Yeah. Right.
We're pretty popular over here with Bigfoot.
hang on just a second.
Well, and you're right. Like as you're finding the story, like it's there. I have heard some absolutely incredible encounters
There it is.
where people have said that Sasquatch actually saved their life on some occasion.
Yes.
Either saved the life of their child who has led the child out of deep woods to population. I mean, there is a side to these creatures, whatever you want to label them as, that are, is clearly kind-hearted and caring and thoughtful. And there is just this seems to be an amazing side to these critters.
Yeah. So this is actually a story out of Manitoba. And this is a great example of just exactly what you were talking about. This young woman's name was Carrie, and the story takes place during the 60s when she was 11 or 12 years old. This is in the community of Dauphin River, which is home to a group of Ojibwe people. Now, as you know, some of the indigenous people in Canada and in the United States as well live pretty primitive lives. And this was back in the 60s. So one of Carrie's chores was carrying water from the nearby creek to her house. Now, this was in the height of berry season. And so she decided she was going to stop and pick some cranberries. Now, Carrie made two mistakes from a search and rescue perspective. One was she wandered off the beaten path, wandered away from the area that she knew as she was searching for berries and picking berries and eating berries. The other thing was that when she realized that she was lost, she ran. I was a search and rescue volunteer for a while when I first moved to Western New York. And, one of the things that we emphasized in educating people was if you get lost, stay put. It makes it much easier for us to find you.
Yeah.
I worked with a dog team, and those dogs are capable of doing amazing things. But, if you're lost, you want to make it as easy as possible for people to find you. So stay put, folks. Unless there's something dangerous in that area, stay put. It makes it much easier for the search and rescue people to find you. Anyway, Carrie didn't know that. Of course, it's the 60s. She's young. She takes off into the woods. She's running and crying and running and crying alternately, and she is totally lost. And as night comes on, she is very fearful because she knows that there are bears in that area, and there are bears big enough to eat her, right? She's 11 years old, 12 years old. She goes, she takes some rest on the moss underneath the trees and stuff. But, as she's making her way through the woods, she's becoming more and more exhausted. She's not able to sleep, of course, because she's terrified that she's going to be eaten or something terrible is going to happen to her. She continued on in this manner for several days, and I think that really the only way that she survived was she had the presence of mind to stop, and it was full berry season, so she's eating berries off the trees or off the bushes whenever she can. But she's not, she's not taking in enough calories to really maintain herself, and she's getting weaker with each passing day. So night had fallen once again, and it seemed that the thing that Carrie had feared most, that a bear was going to get her, was about to happen, because she heard something large moving in the forest. Now, I thought this was kind of funny, so I'm going to read it to you. The child addressed the supposed bear in her native tongue, telling it that, I know you're going to eat me, so do it fast and start with my head.
Oh boy.
So she continues talking to this bear in the Ojibwe language. She's calling it grandfather, which is a term of respect.
Mm-hmm.
She tells it she's lost. She tells it that she's losing her mind with fear. I mean, she figures this thing's going to eat her. She might as well, have a chat with it while she's waiting, right? So she waits for the inevitable, and nothing happens. Whatever it was that was moving around in the brush stops moving. But it keeps creeping closer, and then it stops moving, and then it keeps coming closer. She remembered that it smelled like little puppy poop.
Yeah.
Or roots freshly dug out of the swamp. Whatever the animal was, it stayed close to her, but it didn't come right up to her. So she realized that she wasn't going to get eaten immediately. She reaches out and discovers that she can touch this thing, and that it had hair kind of like a beaver pelt.
Mm.
So she had no idea what this thing was, right? It didn't move anything. It didn't do anything when she touched it, but it got up and walked around. Actually, it didn't do anything. But she kind of had a hold of it, but when she let go of it, it started to walk around. And then it bumped her. And she almost fell down. And she was like, oh boy, here it comes. This is the part where I become a snack, right? But then it bumped her again. And she got up and she started to move. And as she's moving along, this being, whatever it is bumping her in one direction or bumping her in another direction, and keeping her moving in a particular direction. She's going along. It's nighttime. It's pitch black under the forest canopy. So she had no idea what it is that's walking along and bumping her, right? Until day breaks. And she realizes that she's looking at a Sasquatch. Now, when she realizes this, she tries to hide from the creature, but it's like, nah, it's standing there doing the typical peeking out from behind the tree behavior, right? So she knows it's not a bear, but she doesn't really know what it is. She continues along her way, and this Sasquatch keeps bumping her, moving her in a particular direction. It doesn't, like take her hand or anything like that. It just keeps nudging her until she gets to, moving in the direction it wants her to go in. Finally, she actually comes out of the forest into a clear-cut area that she recognizes is a place where the residents, the Ojibwe people, had cut down some trees to build an airstrip, because it's a remote area. Sometimes the only way you can get supplies, medical equipment, the medical emergency, get somebody out, is by air.
Sure.
She knew where she was right away. And she walks away from the tree from the Sasquatch, which is standing in the tree line, walks out to the highway, and there's a truck coming. So she gets picked up by an older gentleman and his son that she knew. So she's crying and hugging the old man, and she tells him that she didn't get eaten by a bear. And he says, "Whoa, did you see a bear?" And she's like, "Oh, I saw this bear with long arms that looked like a monkey." And the older man, basically tells her, grandchild, you were blessed to be saved by this creature. So he takes her home. And she's bruised and bloodied and scratched up, and she's been through quite the ordeal, right? And her parents are just happy to see her alive. And she tells her story, and her parents are like, yeah, sure, yeah, whatever. Her sisters start teasing her about her being the girl who touched a bear. But while
Right.
her parents didn't initially support the story, her father eventually comes along, later, and tells her that when he was a young child, he got lost in the woods too, and a giant monkey took care of him by feeding him fish. By supplying him
Wow.
with fish until he could get out of his situation. So, while on the one hand, we see that the Sasquatch can be very territorial and very scary. On the other hand, we have these stories, as you said, of people actually being saved by these creatures. This wasn't in Canada, but I was recently reading a story in Tom Powell's The Locals, a young girl whose father, she's deaf, and her father has a drinking problem. And she's looking out the window of her home and sees a Sasquatch carrying somebody, and deposits this person in the front yard. Turns out it's her father, who had crashed
Oh
his
my
truck,
gosh.
because he'd been drinking. He crashed his truck like 3 miles away, and this being had carried him back to the house, so
Wow.
that he could be taken care of. So Sasquatch aren't all bad. Just depends on who you run into, I guess. And I have to think, Morgan, that it
That is
also
like,
has to do with what your attitude toward these creatures is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
yeah.
as you say, if you come into, I wouldn't want to be one of these yahoos that sits out in the forest with a gun who wants to bag a Sasquatch. If
Yeah, I agree.
they actually encountered one of these creatures. Because first of all, I don't think they would survive the encounter. And second of all, they would probably end up being amongst those people who go missing and nobody ever finds them. I think it has a lot to do with your attitude toward these beings, and what your experience is going to be like.
Well, I'll tell you, it's what we found with
Sure.
Dogman here is, I mean, the more positive we are, the more
Mhm.
positive we get back, and it's been phenomenal with what we found. And I mean, whether animal, spiritual or not, I mean, they all everybody, including
Sure.
people, respond to energy and respond to our intentions. And I agree. But Travis, this has been absolutely wonderful. I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing these stories, and I really hope that everybody can pick up a copy of Sasquatch Canada Beyond British Columbia. It's really a really great book, so we thank you so much for
thank you for having
coming
me.
on.
I always enjoy talking with you and Mike, and it's always fun to sit around and talk with like-minded people.
Yeah, it's like campfire stories. That's kind of the way I look at it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, we could do a great job of scaring a crud out of people out in the woods.
Sure. Well, let's do it. That would be a blast.
That would
There
be
you
a
go.
blast. That's our next event, Mike.
Right
Gotta
on.
get
That's what we
together
gotta do.
and tell Sasquatch
Right.
stories over a campfire, or Dogman
Exactly.
stories, or
Yeah,
UFO
exactly.
stories.
All the above.
I've got 2 books full of stuff I could tell stories
Absolutely.
about. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and this has been great.
Okay.
And we'll talk to you soon.
Here's Morgan for this episode's segment of Spiritual Healthcare.
In this episode's edition of Spiritual Healthcare, the segment of the show where you get to be the creator and designer of your paranormal and spiritual experience, we're going to tell you about a process called challenging your limiting beliefs. Here's the bad news, guys. Everyone has limiting beliefs. Everyone. So what are they? Any story we tell ourselves that is in direct contrast to what we really want. I want to be happy. Yeah, right. You'll never be happy. It's possible for me to be rich. Yeah, right. Your parents were poor as dirt. I'm talented. Yeah, right. No one has bought my art in years. Limiting beliefs can start anywhere, sometimes beginning in places of childhood, such as parents or school, but ultimately they are our responsibility as adults. We may not have caused them, but they are our responsibility to change. One way to do this is to ask yourself these 3 questions when one of these limiting beliefs hits your awareness. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? If that belief hits on any of those 3 questions, it's time to reevaluate. Part of what allows us to reevaluate our lives is accountability, and the first person and most important that we are accountable to is us. We owe it to ourselves to be loving, kind, gentle, and above all else, honest. Keep these 3 questions on your radar, and the next time your limiting beliefs gets in the way, give them a run for their money. You need nothing to be happy, but you need something to be sad. Remember, at the end of seeking, all is consciousness. Stay in peace, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Supernatural Circumstances, a co-production of Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings and Good Egg Studios. This podcast is part of the Curious Cast podcast network. Theme music by Corey Johnson of Catalyst Records in Edmonton, Alberta. You can find out more about Morgan Knutson at entityseeker.ca and more about me and listen to my other show at darkpoutine.com. Feel free to email the show at supernaturalcircumstances@gmail.com. Good night for now.